So I try to get those recordings on at the end of, I try to stop. This is the last class of the day for me, so I try to get those recordings online for you on Angel as soon as I'm finished. So to back up, to make a logical starting place for this lecture, we had talked about environmental legislation and how in the United States, it was really in the 1970s that a lot of our major environmental legislation was enacted. And there's been 40 major environmental laws since 1970 that have resulted in really wonderful advances for our country. We have an Endangered Species Act, a Clean Water Act, a Clean Air Act. Energy conservation laws have gone into effect, hazardous waste, pesticide laws, and all of this has greatly improved environmental quality in the United States. We've had new national parks, 106 million plus acres have been set aside, and we've seen major advances in reduction of soil erosion. And we need to remember that soil is a natural resource. And this is something that once it's degraded, it is not easily restored. So we've seen a lot that has really been very positive since 1970. In fact, we covered this earlier, that the bald eagle, our national symbol, had actually ended up on the endangered species list. And can anyone tell me why? Do you remember what it was that happened to these birds that put them on the endangered species list? Yes. The eggs were cracking, and do you know what caused that? DDT, accumulation of a pesticide, DDT. So DDT was being sprayed in the environment for controlling insect pests, both on crops, and also it was another huge use for it was controlling mosquitoes. So they would go out and spray areas for mosquito control, and of course in those aquatic environments, that pesticide could get picked up by the plankton, and then that would be eaten by small little filter feeder fish that would then get eaten by larger fish, and then the eagles are eating the bigger fish. And what happened was you had this accumulation of DDT in the tissues of these top birds of prey. And then when the birds would sit on their eggs to incubate them, the shells were so fragile they would just crack. And so they actually ended up on the endangered species list. And they're a success story in that they have now been removed from the endangered species list. They are still on a list of what we would call threatened. We do, keep an eye on them, and they, of course, since they're our national symbol, we do have protections for the bald eagle. But pollution control has really been a major accomplishment of these acts of legislation. We have a lot of more work to do, but we have really seen major advances in the quality of our environment and our life in North America due to a lot of this legislation. And so the Environmental Protection Agency, also known as the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, issued a report in the year 2008 that provided information a lot about the different successes of our legislation and what was kind of left to do. So we do still have some things to do. But I wanted to point this out, is that before the 1970s, and this is not within your lifetimes for most of you, it's within mine and I'm sure it's within Lee's, the legislation wasn't there. So, of course, we didn't have the population that we have now either. So you can imagine what it would be like if we had the limited protections for the environment having double the population, since we've doubled since 1968. This is a photograph of the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland, Ohio, near Erie, Pennsylvania, where the river meets Lake Erie. And look at the brown concentration. A lot of this was oil-type products, thick petroleum-type products. And you can even see the individual's hand here where he stuck his hand into the river, and it's come up just covered in oil residues. And the pollution was so serious in this waterway. And this is where I showed you this. I kind of hurried up and ended the lecture with this. But the river itself caught on fire on several occasions. So how do you put out a fire on a river? It's already, put water on it? Well, it's already on water, okay? So what had happened is there was so many oil slicks and other pollutants floating on the top of the water that the rivers caught on fire. So we had major issues with water pollution before the things like the Clean Water Act. So this Clean Water Act in particular, there was a law earlier, the Federal Water Pollution Control Act in 1948, which was the first one to try to address the question of water pollution. Prior to that time, basically anybody could dump anything anywhere. And many municipalities, in fact, did just do things like dump raw sewage into waters. Factories could just put their waste in a river. It kind of went back to what we talked about, that Western mentality of the nature is out there to be tamed, and everyone just thought that nature was inexhaustible, and that if you put out pollution that the earth would somehow clean it up magically, that just dumping it into a river, dumping it in the ocean, putting things out in the air, nature would clean it up, because we'd never had instances where it hadn't before. But we started putting out kinds of compounds, different types of compounds, and putting them out in such a volume that nature could no longer filter or clean these things up. So there was some original legislation in 1948, but it really was in the 1970s, in 1972 and 77, that we had what is now known as the Clean Water Act became law. And in 1970, Richard Nixon revised some prior legislation and came up with the Clean Air Act. And this is something that we have to regularly, keep up with to make sure that these standards are appropriate for, the situation that we're in at that particular time. But this is an example of what Steubenville, Ohio looked like in 1972. So you didn't have regulations on what could come out of a smokestack. So the factories would just put out whatever. We didn't have pollution control devices on our cars. We didn't have any of this type of stuff to help mitigate the pollution that was going out in the air. So you would regularly see these clouds of smoke over industrial areas. China. China is an example of what our country could look like if we had not enacted the Clean Water and the Clean Air Act. Okay? In fact, part of the reason that a lot of our jobs left the United States is because we did enact these laws, and factories would move to places where they knew that they didn't have to institute these kinds of environmental controls. And we can look and see what would have happened if we had kind of let this happen. I mean, there's a lot of other reasons that they moved, cheaper labor, but obviously one of them was the fact that it was less expensive to manufacture a product if you can just dump your waste wherever you want and don't have to pay for any mitigation. And these are everyday photos around China. This is not an unusual circumstance to see these kinds of pollution levels in Beijing and some of the other countries. That's just a good day in Beijing, what you see right there. Very heavy levels of pollution. I hope this is going to come up. I found this link last night. Okay. The Guardian is a newspaper in Great Britain. It'd be the equivalent maybe of like our New York Times in the that it's a very credible source of information. And this just came out Tuesday, January 2nd. This was yesterday that this came out. China's air pollution results from unchecked government, top officials say. They have record-breaking, what they're calling apocalypse of air pollution caused by unsupervised political power. And if I can get this to scroll down, what this article is saying, here's a baby. I mean, they have people that are showing up in hospitals with major health-related problems due to these, the quality of the air, or I should say the lack of quality of the air. So they are now experiencing what's known as record-breaking pollution in Beijing. And they mentioned that on January 12th, so what's that, 2 weeks, not even 2 weeks ago, Beijing hit a level of 755 on a U.S. Environmental Protection Agency designated scale that only goes to 500. And they hit 755 on it. Anything greater than 25 is considered to be bad for your health. And they hit 755 on the scale. Their stores are running out of anti-pollution face masks. Flights are delayed because they can't see very well. Hospital respiratory wards are overrun with patients that are suffering from, respiratory distress due to health issues associated with this. And they're facing environmental, here's what one internet users are calling it, the airpocalypse. So this is the kind of things that's going to happen if you have a large population, heavy manufacturing, and you have no pollution controls. So this would be a perfect example of what the United States potentially could have looked like had we not put in this kind of legislation. Now, I'm still not saying that we have the world's best air quality. We certainly don't. But for when you consider what it could be like, just look at China as an example. And
that's the best air.
Probably the best air quality. I don't really know. It's probably going to be like Antarctica or somewhere where there's not much of anything. Hawaii probably has pretty good air quality because they're in the middle of the Pacific Ocean and they don't have any industry. So what you want to do is get away from industry and get somewhere where you have a lot of natural barrier around you. Okay, so it's basically based on the manufacturing and that sort of stuff. But eventually it does all work out. I mean, it's got to stay within the stratosphere. So what we make and put in the stratosphere stays in the stratosphere. I couldn't get to the NBC Nightly News link, but they were saying the pollution in Beijing has been so bad that it's visible from the space station, that you can see the clouds of pollution coming from Beijing from space. It's that bad. Okay. So this is just... Okay, yes, absolutely. No problem. No problem. So, anyway, now Beijing is going to face this issue where they do need to do something about their air because their citizens are getting ill. This is just paging down within here. We're not going to go into a 40-minute documentary on this, but anyway, that's very bad situation right now in China. Okay, so I'd mentioned before that probably part of the reason that manufacturing declined in the United States was that the economics of pollution. So some companies chose to move overseas, and the economics of pollution control was, I'm sure, one of those reasons. It's not cheap to clean up pollution. There's an expense associated with it. As I like to say, do you ever put your garbage out on the street and expect that someone's going to just come and pick it up for free? No, you need to pay for a trash removal service. Even if you live in a city where they have trash removal, it's your taxes that are paying for it. So it's always going to cost you to clean up. And so there is an economic burden associated with pollution control and in keeping the environment healthy. And if we look at economics, which is basically the study of how people use limited resources to satisfy basically what are considered to be unlimited needs, you have a supply and a demand that determines prices. And obviously we know if something's in great supply, great demand and short supply, you see it costs more. And suppliers produce as long as the selling price is more than the cost of production. And if they want to keep their prices low so that they can produce more cheaply, then they're, of course, going to move where they can manufacture things and save themselves money. So you have to look at this interaction between demand and supply and cost and price and all of this as it relates to economies. But what you also have to remember is the economy depends upon several different things. Not only do you have to have a source for materials, but you also have to have what's called a sink. And the sink is where the waste is going to go. So you need to think about these things when figuring out the cost of your products. So in other words, where are you getting these raw materials? Okay, so for instance, within a natural environment, wood is harvested, and that's used for making paper. And so we need to have, in order to keep paper supply, we need to have good forests. And then those products need to go from the forest. And then, of course, there are going to be products are going to be made, like paper products, and that's going to stimulate the economy. And, you know, we have quite a bit of paper consumed in our country. And then we have to look at what's going to happen to all of that paper when we're done with it. And what about the waste product from the manufacturing of that paper? So we need to look at the whole scheme of sometimes what I've heard called the cradle to grave type of economics of different products. Okay? And what I want to point out is there's that fish. And that goldfish is in a bowl. Okay? So what is that fish going to need to stay alive?
Water.
Yes.
Food.
Food.
Clean water.
And clean water. So I can feed that fish, and I can keep adding food and make sure that it never starves. But there's a surefire way to kill that fish, even though I'm feeding it, and that's to never change its water. So the point I'm trying to make is that not only do we need the raw materials, but we need the sink. We need to get rid of the waste. And you can see that when you look at one of these fish bowls. Basically, the planet is like one of these fish bowls. We are in a contained system. And what can kill you sometimes faster is a buildup of waste, just as quickly as not having enough of resource. Okay? So we need to consider this, and this is something that we've had the luxury of not truly considering in the past. When the population was small and our demands weren't so high, we didn't have to consider pollution that much. People didn't have bad intentions. They just honestly didn't know that, they just thought that the capacity of the earth to clean up messes was unlimited. So we need to look at things as what we can call natural capital. Referring to capital in the standpoint of economics, your money or your supply, your capital. So our natural capital is going to be resources and processes that sustain living organisms and humans. So anything that we're going to utilize to sustain us as people and as a planet. So that's going to include humans and all the things that we need. Then we also need to consider this whole thing of sources and sinks. Those are both parts of natural capital. These are going to be things like minerals, forests, soils, water, clean air, wildlife, fisheries. We need all of these things. These are all part of our natural capital. The environment provides a lot of natural capital for human production and consumption. So we need the forests. We need the mineral ores. We need the oceans that have the fish to feed us. So we really do depend upon this natural capital. And we can threaten our long-term economic future by not paying attention to this. If we have resource degradation. And I know I've used Haiti as an example many different times because those individuals down there are in such desperate situation. They depended upon their forests. They need that wood in order to cook and in order to boil water because their drinking water quality is so bad. They have cholera and other disease outbreaks down there, so they need to boil that water. But the problem is they've overused that resource. They have not taken the wood and the trees in a sustainable manner. They're in a desperate situation, so you can't fault them at all. But what's happened is that they're running out of wood. They don't have it anymore because they've taken it from in a manner that isn't sustainable. They're removing it faster than it can be replenished. And so that's one example of where you have a long-term economic future that's being threatened by a short-term need. And that's what we would call an overuse of sources. But the other thing is we can also overuse our sinks, which is what's going to clean up pollution. So if we continue to dump nutrient-rich sewage effluent into our rivers and streams, we may degrade fisheries. A good example is what's happened to the oyster industry in Maryland. I'm from Maryland and from the Eastern Shore, so we're very much into our seafood industry down there. But oysters used to be a very big cash crop for watermen in the Chesapeake Bay. And due to pollution, the oyster population dropped dramatically. Now, there was also a disease that got into the oysters, but they think that's because the oysters were more susceptible because they were weakened due to pollution. So they're trying to bring back the health of the bay, and they have little oyster farms now, and they're trying to bring that back. But that's an example of where we've overused a sink. And that's caused economic damage, particularly if you're a waterman. That's economic damage for you. Okay, so the way that our country works, and this is something that's kind of up for international discussion right now, but the way that right now that governments judge or kind of compare how they're doing is they have these measures of total income for a nation's goods and services for a given year. And you've probably heard this before, gross domestic product, the GDP. So they'll use this number to compare the economies of various nations. So what's the gross domestic product? So in other words, what is the value of the goods and services? Now, gross means like the face value of it. Net domestic product is, of course, once you remove the costs from it. But usually they'll talk about a nation's economy and the standpoint of GDP. And that's an important indicator of the health of a country's economy. But one of the things that they don't take into account when you compare the GDP, the gross domestic product, and the net domestic product, those figures do not include the costs of resource depletion and pollution. So you could, in theory, have very favorable numbers when you're looking at the gross domestic product, like China. Okay, they would have a favorable gross domestic product. You look at like how much they're producing and where they are economically. Would you want to live in Beijing? Okay, there's no accounting for the pollution. There's no accounting for the depletion of the natural resources that are being used. So it's simply looking at production. Okay. Many countries are having this discussion now of maybe we need to, as a planet, as humanity, perhaps look at a different system of comparing national economies that takes into account resource depletion and pollution. Because I'll tell you one thing, China's gross domestic product may be higher than the United States, but I don't want to go there. I don't want to live there. That to me is not a quality of life. And so that needs to, people are saying we need to take this into account. That when you're figuring out something like they're saying we need some other kind of an economic indicator that's going to take into account profits and costs. Because right now, polluting is free when you do the calculations. There's no dollar value associated with the air pollution that China puts out there. Now, there is, however, when you calculate into the United States, with the net domestic product, you have to look at like what the costs were for pollution control. So we may come out on the short end of the stick looking at that, where in fact, in my opinion, my humble opinion, it's preferable for our system. Okay, I realize we're in, economic debt, but again, that's another issue. But as far as like the environment goes, in trying to compare these things, because our economic well-being depends on natural resources, lands and rivers and timber and ocean and oil and air. And we need to determine when the benefits of production exceed the cost. So when have you gotten to the point that you've harmed your health, or you've harmed your ecosystem to a point that it can't recover? So they're saying that they ought to look at natural resource depletion. Take your gross domestic product, and that somehow it's going to equal your net domestic product plus some sort of depreciation. They're saying that it should have some sort of include not only what it costs in natural resources to make that product, but right now it doesn't include anything for depletion or for pollution. So it's simply going to be the cost of your, what did it cost to make the product? What did you have to pay the people to make the product? You can depreciate wear and tear on your equipment. But no one is including in that figure depletion. So for instance, an example here, an oil company drains oil from an underground field. The value is counted as part of our gross domestic product. There's no deduction to account for the fact that the oil is non-renewable, and it's not counted as depreciation against that natural resource. So it just comes out of the ground, and you pay, you consider in the cost analysis the cost of its removal, and if you had to pay any land rent and any refinement, but it's not including the fact that you're removing a non-renewable resource. That in itself is not included in these numbers. So this is why they're saying that if you look at costs and benefits for pollution control, and you look at this situation and evaluate this. Company A produces $100 million and dumps waste polluting a local river. Company B produces $100 million in product, but uses $10 million to properly dispose of waste. There is no pollution, but their gross domestic product is now $90 million. So if you use gross domestic product, Company A contributes more than Company B, because there is no value associated with keeping the river clean. So this is where many nations are saying we need to come up with a better system of environmental economics that takes into account degradation. The economic cost of environmental degradation should be deducted from the gross domestic product. and that there should be some consideration given for improving or not harming the environment. So right now, as I say, China's gross domestic product is going to look much better than ours because that's not taken into account the pollution and the negative effects associated with that. So who's going to clean up all this stuff? Where does that come from? Again, that ends up coming out of our taxes in the long run. So what you've got is a lot of what are known as external costs, borne by people that are not directly involved. Oh, they've just added another 3 months to the debt extension, speaking of economics. You've got these things that are known now as external costs because the company itself isn't necessarily paying for this. Instead, you're paying for it. Borne by people not directly involved in the selling or the buying of the product. For example, the pollution released when fossil fuels are burned and pollution is released to transport a product. That's not borne by them. So, Exxon and Mobil and BP and all these guys can produce fuel, put it in a car, and it pollutes, but they don't pay for that. It's free to pollute at this point. And so there's a real failure to include these external costs in the price of goods. Doesn't matter to them. You buy a toaster and use it for 10 months and it falls apart and it was cheap. Goes to the landfill, they don't pay for that. What do they care? They've made their money. And those are all external costs. And we've seen some terrible things, that have happened to the environment. For instance, pollution is causing things like acid rain, and you may have heard of this. When we burn fossil fuels that are high in sulfur, that sulfur goes into the atmosphere and it can become sulfuric acid. Okay, that's what's in your car battery. So our rains have become quite acidic, and it's a difficult photo, I know, to see, but on the left-hand side is a photo that is taken of a carving that was 206 years old at the time that photo was taken in 1908 on the left-hand side. The photo on the right was taken in 1960. And that is an example. It says it's here in Germany, at the entrance of a building in Germany. The acid rain, the acidic nature, has completely dissolved the face off of that sculpture. So it withstood 206 years looking pretty good. And then, so who pays, what's the cost to society of this? And so how much pollution is acceptable? And it's going to be a big trade-off between protecting environmental quality while still allowing us to economically produce goods that we need. So it's really a balancing act. You have to look at what is the cost of pollution, degrading the environment, versus the cost of eliminating that pollution in terms of giving up goods. So this is something that really economically we need to examine as not just a nation, but as an international community. Okay, what is the true cost of all of these goods and the pollution that results from these? Okay. So if we consider in there, for instance, marginal costs of pollution, that would be the added cost of an additional unit of pollution. So whatever that happens to be. So let's just say it's a ton of sulfur, for instance. That would be the unit. What is the cost of the damage to somebody's health, property? What's the damage to agriculture? Because pollution does hurt our ability to produce our foods. try to assign some sort of a dollar value to that, and that's not an easy thing to do. So for instance, here they're giving an example with sulfur dioxide. It's a waste product of fossil fuel burning, particularly low quality coal. And China is putting on, I think it's the equivalent of like a new coal-fired power plant, almost like another one every week or 2 weeks. And China has low quality coal, very high in sulfur content. So not only do you have the smog and the smoke associated with those coal fires, but you have all of this sulfur. And the sulfur is producing acid rain. This acid rain damages aquatic ecosystems. So it's going to damage the oceans, it's going to damage the rivers, it's going to damage the fisheries, and it's going to damage the forests and agriculture. So we need to find a way to assign some sort of a value for what's happening. So what they're saying, what they're proposing is with the marginal cost of pollution, here we have a graph. And on the bottom, on the x-axis from low to high is the amount of pollution in tons of waste discharge. And then on the y-axis, on the left-hand side, you go from the cost of damage in dollars from low to high. And as you see, you've got this graph here that at first, it's going to get to a point where it's just, you've got a whole lot of damage caused by the pollution. As you go, the amount is going to cause, as the amount increases, the dollar value of the damage increases. Okay, let's go. Oops. Okay. Go back here. So what we want to look at is the added cost of reducing 1 unit of a given type of pollution. So cost rises as the level of pollution declines, meaning that it's relatively inexpensive sometimes to reduce pollution by, say, like 50%, but reducing it even higher requires more costly devices. So here's an example of trying to figure out the cost of the abatement. So let's just say if I'm trying to reduce the amount of sulfur coming out of a power plant, I can put on a crude filter and it doesn't cost me a lot of money, and I can possibly reduce my pollution by 50%. Now if I want to get that sulfur pollution down to like 0, I might have to start now getting much more expensive equipment to remove the very last traces of something. So what we want to try to do is to figure out where's the optimum amount, and this is really the optimum amount of pollution. It sounds like an oxymoron. Like, is there a good amount of pollution? But what we need to do is look and say, okay, we know that there's a cost associated with pollution. We know there's a cost associated with preventing it or cleaning it up. Where is the sweet spot? Where are we going to get the maximum amount of dollar savings by the value of it's going to be more profitable to actually clean it up in the long run if we can put a value on that pollution. It's what you call a cost benefit analysis. So the cost to society of less pollution is offset by the benefits by the activity of creating it. So policymakers need to look at these kinds of things and decide, where is it worth it? Okay, obviously if we needed to remove every molecule of sulfur and it's going to be a really high cost, it's not going to be worth it. But if we can enact legislation and regulations to reduce the majority at a relatively lower price, then that's where you can justify these things. Okay. So this is what it's doing. So it's looking at the cost of pollution, it's looking at the cost of abatement, and finding the sweet spot. So if we look at this, for some reason this is not keeping up here. Yep, it may have timed out on here. Oops, there we go. It's this going to be this sweet spot right here in the middle, the economic optimum. That's the economic, the optimum for pollution. So in other words, we can get that much of pollution reduced for the least economic input. That should be the kinds of things that we need to try to figure out for these different situations. Okay, so if we put that kind of strategy in effect, the thing is now, how do you enforce it? You have what are called command and control regulations. And this is what you have with your cars right now. You go and you take your car and they test your tailpipe. They set limits on the levels of pollution. That's what's command and control. So they require some sort of a specific action. Have you ever seen these guys out here? Have you seen the smoke schools in the parking lot? They come out with the big smoke machines, and the guys are standing out there in the parking lot looking at the different colors of smoke coming out of that trailer. These are guys that are associated with regulation. So they go around and they learn to recognize different kinds of smoke patterns and things to see what kind of pollution might be coming out of there. And so they're going to go along and they're going to look and say, okay, well, we need to go sample this place because it looks like things aren't going correctly. But in this case, you know, there are regulations that set how much pollution can actually be emitted by a particular plant. So there may be a specific law in effect. Sometimes they may set certain kinds of goals. Like the Clean Air Act of 1990 set a goal of 60% reduction in nitrous oxide emissions by 2003. So these are things that are called command and control. And here's something that is another possibility, and this has been kind of under debate recently, and this is what's called incentive-based regulations. So what they do is the government, because ultimately who pays for pollution is all of us, and it's usually done by cleaning things up in the form of tax money. So the government says, okay, well, rather than pay money to clean it up, maybe we can give some sort of incentives not to pollute. So ideally, the industries would internalize these costs and consider one of those diagrams like I showed you before, the marginal costs and the marginal benefits, and try to figure out where that spot is. And they can reach an optimum where hopefully they can reduce their pollution and get certain incentives from the government. And you can have environmental taxes where somebody's going to get taxed for polluting. But something you may have heard of in the debates is cap and trade. And this would be where companies, and they've talked about a carbon tax, and this would fall under this cap and trade carbon tax. The idea is that each industry is given a certain limit of emissions that they're allowed to produce. That's the cap. If you produce less than your cap, you can trade. You can sell that extra pollution to somebody else. So for instance, let's just say I'm allowed to produce 100 pounds of carbon dioxide in here flapping my lips to you guys every time. Okay, but if I get quiet and I don't talk so much, I only make 80 pounds. Well, I have 20 pounds I'm still allowed. Now, somebody else down the hall is talking a lot more. And they can't get there, they can't keep their carbon emissions down to 100. They're at 120. I can sell my 20 to them. So I have an incentive to produce less pollution because I can sell the part that I didn't use to somebody else. So the cap is 100. The trade is I get to trade what I didn't pollute. So this is that idea of tradable permits that you can, many countries believe, many international policy experts believe that cap and trade is the most promising to manage climate change problems. Because those companies that do have the ability to reduce their pollution can be paid for it. They can sell it, okay? So those that can reduce pollution, right now they have no, remember I showed you Company A and Company B, and Company A had a higher gross domestic product because they didn't have any internalized cost of reducing their pollution. So the one that polluted looked like they had a higher GDP than the one that cleaned up their mess. Well, imagine now what cap and trade does, these tradable permits, is it allows somebody to profit from being cleaner. And if there's another company that's got outdated equipment that can't reduce their pollution, they can buy some of these units from another company or another country even. So what this will do is encourage people to find innovative and cheap ways to reduce their emissions because it actually becomes profitable for them to do so. Within the United States, they did this with acid rain, and EPA, under command and control regulations, mandated that coal-burning plants had to reduce their sulfur emissions. Plants installed expensive equipment, smokestack scrubbers, to get rid of this. By the 1980s, certain plants knew of cheaper ways, but they had in cleaner ways to do it, but they had no incentive to put on these other scrubbers. They were below the cap. So the idea is if you had this cap and trade, that there would have been an incentive for some of those plants to go ahead and institute cleaner measures because they could sell those units. They were under the cap, but they would be able to trade those units to somewhere else that couldn't, because of old technology, maybe update their plant, and they weren't meeting their standards. And rather than them being taxed for exceeding their level, it would be more cost effective for them to purchase units from somebody else. But the ultimate goal is that we're reducing pollution overall. So this is basically where the carbon tax and the cap and trade that you've heard being debated is coming from. And of course, when you start calling it a carbon tax, you know how people react in this country when you say the word tax. Nobody wants to hear another new tax. But in fact, it may be a better system for reducing pollution overall than this command and control with penalties. Okay? So we will pick up here on Friday. Okay, we're at 2:50.